Welcome to Not Local. My name is Zeke Harker. Today, I will be speaking with former U.S. Ambassador Charles Ray. Ambassador Ray served in the Foreign Service for 30 years and held the role of ambassador in Cambodia and Zimbabwe. He is the chairman of the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Africa program, a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy, and author of Ethical Dilemmas and the Practice of Diplomacy, as well as several other books. Before joining the Foreign Service, Ambassador Ray served in the U.S. Army for 20 years, retiring with the rank of Major. I also happen to have had the pleasure of being a student of Ambassador Ray's in his master's course on the African continent. Without further ado, I give you Ambassador Charles Ray. I am here with Ambassador Charles Ray. Ambassador Ray, thanks for taking some time to talk with me on a Sunday. So let's get right into it. You served in the U.S. Army for 20 years.
Yes.
And then you joined the U.S. Foreign Service. So how did that come to pass?
Well, when I was finishing my 20-year Army career and thinking about what was next, I had a friend where I was stationed at the Defense Language Institute out in Monterey, California, who I used to have lunch. She was a librarian, and we would have lunch together sometimes. Just discussing it, she suggested that diplomacy sounded like something that I might find a good fit for my skills and interests. And that's how I actually came to learn about joining the Foreign Service from a military base librarian who found the information in a book that was so old it predated postal zip codes.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
But that's really it. I mean, it was, and the strange thing about it is during my time in the Army, I worked with embassies a lot. I was an intelligence officer, and so a lot of my overseas tours sort of overlapped with things that the embassies were involved in. And in all those years and all those embassy staff people that I spoke to, not one of them ever mentioned how they got their jobs or what the career was about. You know, it was you go in, you brief them, they say thank you, and you leave, and that was really it. They weren't very good at recruiting.
That's funny. So you come into the Foreign Service out of the Army, and you have a 30-year career in the Foreign Service. So I mean, It's one thing to join Foreign Service. It's another thing to stay there for as long as you did. So what was the key to the staying power there? What kept your interest?
Because it was interesting. I mean, it's sort of like my career in the Army. I joined the Army basically to get my VA benefits so I could go to college, and wound up staying 20 years because they had me doing things that I found interesting. When I joined the Foreign Service, it was much the same. I wasn't quite ready for a 9-to-5 existence. I'm still not. I mean, after all those years, I still can't see myself going to an office every day, the same office, same people. Mm-hmm. So I joined the Foreign Service because it sounded interesting, a chance to do some more traveling, see some more of the world, and do some interesting things. And it lived up to the hype. I did one interesting non-traditional tour after another until I woke up one day and I was actually past mandatory retirement because when I turned 65, I was ambassador to Zimbabwe, and under the law, if you're on a presidential appointment, they waive the mandatory retirement age until your appointment ends. So, I mean, it's just wake up one day. This is my approach to work. If I wake up one day and I'm not interested in what I'm doing, I look for something else to do.
Yeah, no, that's a good instinct to have. I feel very much the same way. So in the same vein, doing things that are important to you, that keep your interest. You joined the Foreign Service, and what is the mission of the U.S. Foreign Service, and how is it that the State Department Foreign Service officers carry that mission out?
Yeah, the Foreign Service, the State Department, all of Foreign Service actually are the people who are charged with implementing the nation's foreign policy overseas and working in Washington, making recommendations to the policymakers as to what the appropriate policy should be. Overseas, as a Foreign Service officer or as an American diplomat, you're representing American interests. Your number one priority, of course, is to protect the interests of Americans in the country where you're assigned. That's American citizens who work there or live there or who are just visiting as tourists. You're there to help them stay out of trouble, get out of trouble, and basically not come to any harm that you can prevent. And you're there to try and get a better understanding of the country you're in to provide the information back to the policymakers in Washington so that their policy is a little bit better informed.
I like to say that we're sort of like the city hall abroad for Americans. We provide services to Americans who are traveling abroad, somewhat similar to the services that they get from their local governments here, except for marriages. We don't conduct marriages, but we do issue birth certificates, death certificates, and that sort of thing. The other thing that we do is we explain American policy and the American culture and society to the foreign government officials and foreign populations. And we try and develop an understanding of the countries where we're assigned to provide information to policymakers in Washington so that they make informed policy decisions about the country.
So in your experience as the former ambassador to Zimbabwe and Cambodia, do you have some examples of some particular projects that you helped facilitate that were meant to solve or aid particular problems in country? And if so, did they help?
Yeah, well, I mean, just one example, one of the priority issues when I was in Cambodia from 2002 to 2005 was the incidence of sex trafficking and sex tourism where you had foreign tourists coming to Cambodia basically to engage in illicit relationships with underage children. And we had just in the U.S., just months before I arrived in Cambodia, actually passed a new law that allowed Americans who do that to be prosecuted in U.S. courts without having, prior to that, if an American did something like that, the only way you could prosecute them in the U.S. was you had to prove that that was their specific intent before they got on the plane to travel to the country. The law was changed that only required you to prove that they had actually committed the act, and they could, if they could be extradited to the U.S., they would be prosecuted. I hadn't been there very long when it was actually the CEO of a company here in the U.S. too, who was arrested by the Cambodian police for not only engaging in carnal contact with a 12-year-old, but also physically assaulted the child and put it on the internet, filmed it and posted it. Was arrested, and I was able, because of the relationship that I developed with the Prime Minister, because we don't have an extradition treaty with Cambodia, was able to come up with a legal workaround to get this individual out of Cambodia into a place where we had customs agents who are responsible for enforcing this law overseas, in a country where we had extradition, where the person was then picked up, extradited, tried, and convicted in a U.S. court. And it was upheld by the Supreme Court as completely legal from start to finish. That's just one example of the things that we do that not only benefits the local, because in fact, in this case of the child trafficking, I helped the Cambodians to develop a program. They actually created a special unit of the police commanded by a woman that was devoted just to these type crimes. And one of the first raids that they conducted after we trained the unit, they recovered one or two young girls who were about 5 or 6 years old.
Oh, God.
So when you think about that, I mean, that probably was the highlight of my tour, to be able to be involved with putting a stop to that type of activity.
Yeah, I feel like that is hopefully quite a rare event, but
No, not as rare as you might think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that is amazing work. I recall when I was in your class in the fall term, you talked about a program that you helped. It wasn't an American program, it was a local program, and a woman started a micro loan program.
Yeah. In Zimbabwe, because we had rather tenuous relations with the government, and most of the government officials were under sanctions, so I couldn't provide direct aid to the government bureau offices or agencies or even the government directly. But so what I did was work with them to identify areas in the country that had a need, because we could provide assistance directly to like villages and schools, as long as it didn't go through the hands of government officials who were on the sanctions list. And the agriculture minister, who was, interestingly enough, the Minister of Agriculture was on the sanctions list, but his wife was an American citizen. She wasn't on the sanctions list. So it was a strange relationship. I got to know him quite well. And I had him identify some of the poorest villages in the country, in the rural villages that just were lagging way behind in development. And I managed to get a very small allocation of money. I mean, you know, it is pennies. It was maybe $30,000, no more than that. But we used that to create a training program where we went into, I think, 2 villages. We did the pilot project, and we taught them to do. It's a process that I learned. I served in Korea when I was in the Army, and they have a process or practice where local women in the villages get together and they pool their small amounts of money into larger pots. And they use the larger pot of money to make loans to members of their little club to start income generating activities. And we tried to replicate this in these 2 Zimbabwean villages. In the one village that started out, the women were able to contribute $1 each per month. There's about 20 or 30 women in the group. At the end of about 8 or 9 months, when the agriculture minister and I were invited to the village for a briefing on the program, those women were up to $20 donation each per month. They had changed the village to the point where every house had a refrigerator, an air conditioner, and a motorbike. Oh, and a portable generator and a color TV.
Wow.
They had doubled their agricultural output and agricultural income without getting a single penny of aid from the U.S. government or from their own government. They did it all with their own internally generated money.
That is amazing. I still think ever since you first mentioned that, that's one of the more amazing development stories that I've heard from any Foreign Service officers. So, it's one of my favorites.
But I mean, that's actually, it's that kind of thing that you, particularly when you're in countries that are, you're in some countries that they're such high priority. You got half the Senate, half the House, and every senior official in Washington looking over your shoulder. When you're in a country that's low priority, you can experiment like that and find ways to make development work. And that's really sort of my view is, if it doesn't work to actually help people on the ground, it's a waste of money and time.
Yeah.
But those are just some of the things that diplomats do.
Yeah. You mentioned at the time the government of Zimbabwe was under sanctions from the United States. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on how that comes to pass and what that actually means for the people in country. Because from my observation, it seems that oftentimes people in repressive countries often are not responsible for the government that is in charge. And so there is sort of an asymmetrical punishment that happens.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right. And in the case of Zimbabwe, it wasn't general sanctions. There were sanctions against specific individuals, including the president and 75% of his cabinet, most of the members of his political party who were involved in political violence and repression, primarily during the elections in the late 90s. There was a huge amount of violence. There were also the illegal land seizures. And so we had about 270 individuals and maybe 20 companies were on sanctions. And what sanctions meant is that government officials were banned from travel to the U.S. except for United Nations activities that they were invited to. Those who had bank accounts in the U.S., their bank accounts were seized. They were not allowed to conduct any business through the U.S. banking system, which in effect in many countries means they can't do any business, because even in foreign countries, a lot of the international transactions go through the U.S. banking systems, especially the banks in New York and San Francisco. And they couldn't receive any, like, for example, a government minister who was on sanctions, the ministry that he was in charge of could not receive U.S. funding.
That's interesting.
Now, the other thing, going back to sort of you sort of hinted that you don't think sanctions actually make a difference. The fact is they don't really in most cases. The sanctions in Zimbabwe were meant to force the people in government who were blocking democratization to stop doing it, and they didn't work. They continue. They're still doing it. You know, I've been away from Zimbabwe now for almost 12 years, and the same people who were doing it when I was there are still doing it today.
Yeah.
And the sanctions have not changed their behavior one bit.
Well, I understand the concept of sanctions as a matter of incentivizing better behavior. If, for instance, the people who are behaving poorly use U.S. banking systems and you sanction them so they can no longer use them, it's a pain point to try and, refinagle your financial incomes so that they go through different outlets other than U.S. controlled banking systems. And in that sense, I understand that they have utility. It's just I often find that sanctions affect people of a country more than the people they're actually targeted at.
Well, they do, and the thing you have to remember about that type of sanction, it only works if everyone does it. If the U.S., if we don't allow people to use the U.S. banking system, but Hong Kong or Switzerland or Abu Dhabi, Dubai are allowing it, then they just switch their banking habits. Right. And this is basically what happens in places like Zimbabwe. They were receiving support from the Chinese and from the Russians, and so they couldn't use the U.S. banking system, but they could use the Chinese banking system. There are just hundreds of ways to get around. In fact, even some European banks were doing business with the Zimbabweans because it made them a lot of money. And so when you don't have everyone signing up to do the sanctions, the pain is, you're right, the people who are hurt are the local people who sort of get caught up in it. Mm-hmm. Now, in Zimbabwe, one of our jobs there was to explain that the sanctions were not against the country as a whole, and was not against the people, so that, for example, American companies could still do business in Zimbabwe. They just couldn't do business with those 270 odd individuals. They couldn't do business with the 20 or so institutions that were on the list. But in a country like Zimbabwe, that left a lot. I mean, Coca-Cola and a couple of other American businesses have been there. I mean, Coca-Cola's been there since it was Rhodesia. I mean, they've been selling Coca-Cola in Zimbabwe since the early 1900s. One of the first Ford cars sold abroad was sold in Rhodesia, and the guy that owns it, who is, I think, has been inherited from his great grandfather, still has it running. So part of the embassy's job is to ensure that if we do have sanctions, they're appropriately applied and they're not misapplied. And we spend a lot of our time in Zimbabwe getting in touch with companies here in the U.S. to say, yes, you can sell medicine to that drugstore because it's not a sanctioned entity. So, it's again, that's what diplomats do.
Yeah.
It's our job to try and explain things to people.
That's great. So, interesting lead into the next question is, there are governments. Zimbabwe is a good example. I think Cambodia is also a good example. There are not governments that are structured like the United States. And so what challenges does that present for a foreign service officer where, the methods of getting things done through the government are different? Perhaps even there are values within the government that are not shared amongst U.S. foreign service officers. And what are some of those challenges?
Well, I mean, the challenge is to learn how things operate. And frankly, that comment about, the government of Canada doesn't operate the same way the government of the U.S. does. And working with Canada working with the UK can be a challenge.
Sure. Yeah.
Because, and just to give you an example, I worked one of my jobs in the State Department back in Washington was in the Office of Defense Trade Controls. It's the office that does the licensing for certain defense services and machine equipment to foreign entities. Mm-hmm. So whenever we licensed anything to a company in England, we always had a problem doing we always did a follow-up to make sure that they weren't diverting it to the wrong place. But in England, a foreign government official cannot enter an English factory, period. I mean, they have some kind of proprietary secrecy laws, and so we were constrained more in England following up to do checks on whether the companies we were selling to were using the equipment properly than we were in, say, Korea or even Cambodia. I mean, I had more access to factories in Cambodia than our diplomats in England have to factories there.
That's interesting.
So there's always the issue of you are in a country that runs differently, that's organized differently, and you have to understand that. Right. The line you draw is if something they do would violate U.S. law, then you still have to abide by U.S. law as a diplomat, and so you draw the line there. If it's different. But just for example, in the U.S., when you have an appointment with a government official, you go in, you get right down to business, you do your business, and you get up and leave. In most foreign countries, especially countries like Zimbabwe or Cambodia that are sort of traditionalist, it's a completely different way. The first half of any meeting is spent just socializing, just sort of making people comfortable, which a lot of Americans are not comfortable doing. I mean, I know a lot of diplomats have problems in countries where you have to have tea time before you get down to business. I know in Cambodia, just for example, one of the things there is they're very sociable people, Cambodians. They will do business, but they do it on their terms. And so if you want to be effective with Cambodians, a number of things you have to do. You have to be comfortable at doing karaoke. You have to have a high capacity for drinking tea, and if you play golf. And just talking about this issue with the child sex trafficking, one of the things that enabled us to do what we did was I was invited by the Prime Minister right after I arrived to join him for a game of golf. So I accepted, and he and I played golf about once or twice a month. I was the first and only American ambassador to do that. My predecessor, his response was, I don't have time to waste on a golf course. So, it's this type of thing that as a diplomat, you have to learn to get into the temporal flow of the country you're in, but also just the customs. You can't go and be the ugly American. I do things my way in a country where they do things differently. And you can still stick to your principles of respect for people, not breaking the law, but if you follow their customs, their traditions, I don't mean things like bribes, but I mean just the tradition of you go in and you sit down and you spend a few minutes just saying, hey, how are you? Nice seeing you. Nice weather we're having today, before you start whipping out your talking points and start going down your list, 1, 2, 3. You get more done that way.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So just a more general question, and I think lots of people, especially people who are not super familiar with U.S. foreign policy, would love to know about, especially from your perspective. You were a representative of the United States abroad as an ambassador, and I'd just like to ask you about what the perception of the United States has been amongst foreign nationals most commonly for you. And I'm sure you get a variety. Some people love the United States. Some people hate it. Some people have a lot of gray area. But what have you found is the most common attitude from foreign nationals?
Well, actually, in almost every country that I served in, the most common attitude is that people actually like Americans as people. I mean, we're sort of clumsy and we don't always understand local cultures, but we mean well. They like American culture. I mean, American movies, until the Korean soap operas took over the cultural world, American movies were popular. Blue jeans and Coca-Cola are still popular almost anywhere you go. What they don't like is some of our policies and the way we implement them. And frankly, just from my perspective as a diplomat having to carry out a policy, sometimes we come across as being patronizing and pushy. If we're not careful. And I'll just give you an example.
Please. When
the International Criminal Court was formed, we refused to join it. And the reason we refused was valid. The fear was that some countries would use the ICC as a propaganda tool to hit back at the U.S. because they had an issue with us, and some did. I mean, was it? I'm blocking on Henry Kissinger. Has there's been a number of countries who wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Henry Kissinger as a war criminal. So we refused to join. It was decided that we would approach governments and ask them to commit to not referring American citizens to the International Criminal Court, which is, again, nothing wrong with that. But we added to that requirement, if they refused to do it, we would reduce aid, or we would cut aid, and it's a coercive thing. And to me, that just undercut the whole idea of you're going in and saying, we want you to do this, and if you don't do it, we're going to punish you.
Right. That's the strong-handed approach was.
And a lot of people actually resent that. I mean, people who would ordinarily have agreed, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do this, and we can be reciprocal, just don't like the idea of don't give me this or else part. And in my case, when I approached the government on that, I never mentioned the aid bit. I basically talked about the American justice system and our commitment to rule of law and our fear of this being used for propaganda purposes, and that we would greatly appreciate their commitment not to refer American citizens, and the government agreed. I mean, they knew what was being said in a lot of other places, but I think because they appreciated my not coming in with the bullying approach, they agreed and signed the agreement right away. That's an example of people in foreign countries do not dislike Americans. So, you had the big question after 9/11 was, why do they hate us? Most people do not hate Americans. What they don't like is the way the American government sometimes conducts itself. We just tend to stomp too hard sometimes when we go places, and a softer approach is always more effective. Just another example, we are constantly harping at countries that are nascent democracies who have had problems with their elections, and we routinely go in and criticize them for it, which I, as an American, found embarrassing. It's like, for example, after the debacle of the 2000 elections with the hanging chads in Florida, and I would hate to be in a country talking to them about elections now after what we've gone through for the last 3 years. We sometimes don't hold ourselves to the same standard that we hold other countries, and they know better than we do what goes on sometimes here in the U.S. And for a diplomat to go in with a sort of a preachy attitude about what's going wrong in a country can be very difficult. I mean, just to another example, and this goes historically back in the 50s when we were pushing democracy and respect for human rights abroad, routinely people were firing back at us. Well, what about Jim Crow and segregation in the U.S.? I mean, don't come and talk to us about treating our minorities better when you don't do a good job of it. And these are things that, as a diplomat, you have to find ways to work around. I found the best way is to just admit, we have problems in the U.S. too, and we're trying to work on them. So let's talk about your problem. Yeah, but that's an issue, and that's something that people in foreign countries see and react to. We have to be very careful how we talk to and about other countries because they can always find something in this country that they can throw back at us. And that's what I've found in most of the countries I've served in or been in is they like Americans. They even like America as a place. They'd love to visit, go to school and do all this. And everybody wants to go to Disneyland. But they don't particularly sometimes care for how we conduct our business.
Sure. So after 30 years of service in the Foreign Service, what is your perception of the United States and the mission of U.S. foreign policy abroad and how well we conduct it? You just enumerated a few things that we probably can improve on, but on the whole, how do you feel we do as an ethical actor in the world?
Well, in terms of ethics, I think we probably have, and the people on the ground overseas are among the most ethical. The problem we have sometimes is that the guidance we get from the political leadership, while it's not unethical, it's often blind to the realities. I mean, we tend, I think, sometimes not to be able, as a government, to see other points of view and to see where our actions and our activities are undercutting the things that we're trying to achieve. We also tend to be too short-term focused. I mean, we have a hard time in this country, and I made this point a lot when I was a diplomat, seeing past, our time horizon is 2 years at the max. We have a hard time putting effort into doing something that may take 10 or 15 years to come to fruition. And there are some things that you just can't do in less time than that. Mm-hmm. You have to adjust your temporal framework if you want to get anything done. And that's, I mean, I see that now. I run a research program for a think tank in Philadelphia, and assessing some of the policies in regard to my area, what I've noticed is that we have a tendency to come up with a great paper and do a great launch and get some nice press, and then that's it. We're done. Mm. We've got good press, and it becomes difficult for the people on the ground to implement these high-sounding policies because Congress doesn't appropriate the money, or the people who make the policy in the administration are so busy on some other crisis of the moment that they no longer have time to pay attention to it. And these are all things that this has nothing to do with what political party is in office either. I mean, this right. is an American government attitude, is that once we get the good press, it's the short-term thing. We fund things from year to year, and whether it gets funded the second year depends on which, political horse trading that goes on, or where you. I'm sure you followed the whole debacle over whether we would support Ukraine. You have half the government wanting to, and the other half not, and without any clear, coherent explanation as to why. Mm-hmm. Other than, well, if you're a different party, so if you're for it, I have to be against it. These are the type of things that frustrate. They frustrate our diplomats who are trying to do their job and do it well. Yeah. And they certainly frustrate foreign audiences who never know from year to year what's the American government's big boogeyman going to be now. I mean, it's those are issues that we've had since the founding of the Republic. I mean, if you consider just the history of diplomacy, we did not have a career diplomatic service until 1924, and we refused to appoint ambassadors until 1890 something. Yep. So, we're an interesting country. To be as powerful as we are, we have some rather underdeveloped practices and traits that I don't think we recognize.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. You mentioned that it doesn't really U.S. foreign policy doesn't diverge much between administrations, which I found very interesting. You served 30 years, so you've served under Republicans and Democrats, and I think a lot of people would be a bit taken aback by the fact that foreign policy in the United States is not largely affected by the party of the current administration and the Oval Office.
No, except for one or two issues,
right?
And that's usually driven by domestic considerations more than anything else.
Yeah,
it does. We tend to make the same mistakes regardless of which party is running things.
Mm-hmm. How unfortunate. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the one or two big things, and they're mostly impacted by domestic policy. I wonder if you have a take on whether domestic politics in the United States often get mapped onto everywhere else in the world, where, we have foreign service missions in Zimbabwe, but how affected is the U.S. the U.S. embassy in Zimbabwe impacted by domestic politics in the United States versus a country that's in the news every day, like Ukraine or like Israel?
Probably less, but only because because you are not in the news every day, you have a little more freedom to operate and to get things done. When you're in a place like Zimbabwe, if as an ambassador, you have a lot of authority if you're willing to exercise it. Mm-hmm. And if you're the ambassador to Israel or you're the ambassador to UK, you have half of Congress and 3/4 of the administration breathing down your neck 24/7. Here in Cambodia or Zimbabwe, I don't know if you're familiar with the old Beetle Bailey comics.
Yes.
The general who hadn't heard from the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. Well, when you're in places like Cambodia or Zimbabwe, you don't hear from the State Department too often, because they just, except for your desk officer and your country director, most of the other people in Washington they don't know where you are. Mm-hmm. And that gives you a lot of freedom to get things done that you wouldn't have if you were in a place where people were watching you constantly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We'll wrap it up in a second here, but just a final question for you. Looking ahead, what are some of the things that you see as foreign policy challenges before us, and what would you say to people who are concerned about the United States and how it acts on the world?
Well, I try to be optimistic even when things aren't going well. I think we're probably over the next 4 to 8 years in for some rough sledding, simply because there's just so many bad things going on in the world. Mm-hmm. And I don't think most Americans don't take the time to educate themselves about it. And they're, most people are concerned about how much they had to pay for a tank of gas than they are climate change.
Right.
And so, but we go through this. If you look at American history, every 60 or 70 years, we go through a bad patch when things look like they're falling apart. And sometimes they literally fall almost apart, and then we cobble them back together and sort of move on. And I'm pretty confident that eventually we're going to reach a point where someone's going to say, okay, enough's enough. This craziness that's going on now has to stop. Even some of the voters are going to start looking and saying, okay, I've had enough of this circus. Let's have an election and put a new bunch of clowns in.
Yeah.
But I think a lot is going to depend on what happens this coming November. What I fear is that for selfish reasons, people are going to make decisions in November that they're not going to be thinking about, for a selfish reason here, without looking at all of the other things that might be impacted. And we could see the next 5 years with a further erosion of American prestige and influence abroad, which is not good for us, and it's really not good for the world. Because as ham-handed and clumsy as we are, we have actually been a net force for good in bringing good things to a lot of people. But when we become so fractured the way we are now that we can't even do things for ourselves properly, then we suffer, the world suffers, and who knows where it will go from there. The optimist in me says that there are enough people who have the common sense to say it's gone on long enough that we'll be able to stop the train before it runs off the tracks. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. We'll see.
Yes, well, I share that same optimism, so hopefully we are right.
Really.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving me the time today. I appreciate it.
Sure.
So once again, thank you, Ambassador Charles Ray, and I will look forward to having our next conversation.
All righty.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks, sir.